Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. I'm Maggie Williams. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics here at Harvard. Tonight, former White House speechwriters talk about the art and the challenges of crafting speeches for the President of the United States. Our moderator is Ann Compton, a pioneer in broadcast journalism, a reporter of unparalleled import and impact. She also may have listened to more White House speeches than anyone in America. Ann Compton was the first woman assigned by a television network to cover the White House. She became the White House correspondent for ABC News in 1974. Over the course of an extraordinary career, Ann has covered 7 presidents and 10 presidential campaigns before retiring in 2014. But the retirement didn't last very long because ABC brought her back to cover the presidential conventions last year. She also served twice as a panelist in presidential campaign debates. Ann's work has earned many awards and honors, including an Emmy, a Peabody, and she's also been inducted into 6 Halls of Fame and 5 honorary degrees. And she is a former president of the White House Correspondents Association and chaired the Radio Television Correspondents Association on Capitol Hill. A native of Chicago, Ann began her career as a reporter and anchor at WDBJ-TV in Roanoke, Virginia, and she now serves on the governing council of the Miller Center for the Study of the Presidency at the University of Virginia. And finally, this is a bit of a homecoming for Ann because she was an Institute of Politics Fellow last fall. It's great to have her back, and it's my great pleasure to present a role model for everyone. Ann is one of the kindest, smartest, least self-centered, and most fearless women I've ever known. Welcome back, Ann.
Thank you, Maggie, and welcome to all of you. Words matter. And when they are spoken by the President of the United States, they have immediate global impact, and those words live forever. As the first president I covered used to say, there are no second takes in the Oval Office. I've always considered White House speechwriting to be an art form, as the name of this forum suggests. I want you to welcome 3 guests, 3 writers worthy of a master class in their field. All 3 have roots right here at Harvard. Cody Keenan, a legend, born at the dawn of the Reagan administration, who was the 3rd president I covered. And I started when I was 11.
I was born in the last 3 months of Carter.
Oh, well, that makes it
a little easier.
Little better. I will let him tell you how he grew up in suburban Chicago, childhood, Northwestern University, where they say you tried pre-med and Chinese before he finally got around to politics. A Kennedy School graduate degree in speechwriting to become the power behind Barack Obama's voice. Sarah Hurwitz, Harvard's own undergraduate, law degree, and now a fellow here at the Institute of Politics, whose years of writing for Democratic elected officials needed an even more nuanced pen when she took the lead writing for First Lady Michelle Obama. John McConnell, a former IOP fellow and a longtime friend of mine from his 10 years in 2 Bush White Houses when America was attacked and entered the longest wars in its history. John was right there in the West Wing when passions flared and words could be a matter of life and death. Each of them has brought clips this afternoon of significant speech moments, but first, briefly, could I ask each of you, how in the world did you find a path from pre-med, Chinese, and whatever to speechwriting? Cody Keenan.
Well, I gradually set my sights lower to politics. I worked in the Senate for 4 years for Ted Kennedy and then came here to go to graduate school. And it was actually just kind of luck. Stephanie Cutter, who was one of my mentors and coworkers in Kennedy's office, came here to do a study group. And we went out for beers afterwards, and she asked what I was doing over the summer, and I told her I didn't know yet, and she said, you should go write for this guy, Barack Obama. And I said, well, that's great, but I'm not a speechwriter. And she said she'd seen some of the things I'd written in the Senate, and she connected me with John Favreau, who was a speechwriter at the time, and that was it. 10 years ago now.
Wow.
I joined the campaign.
Wonderful.
So.
Wonderful. Sarah, how about you? You had a law career.
I know. So I actually interned in Vice President Gore's speechwriting office, and the speechwriters I interned for, they helped me get my first jobs out of college. And then, I wound up in law school where I actually met this guy named Josh Gottheimer, who's now now a member of Congress from New Jersey, and we freelanced together in law school, and he pulled me onto jobs on Wes Clark's primary campaign, on John Kerry's Senate campaign. He helped me get a job as Hillary Clinton's chief speechwriter. And then when Hillary lost in 2008, I got a call from John Favreau, who was then Senator Obama's chief speechwriter, and we'd known each other from the Kerry campaign. And he said, look, man, tough campaign, sorry about how it turned out for you, but would you want to come work for me writing for Senator Obama? And I said yes, and that's it. And I actually met Mrs. Obama on the campaign when I worked on her 2008 DNC speech.
John McConnell, we've had a mentor, we've had the campaign winners, losers. How did you get from Wisconsin to political writing?
Well, I was just out of law school at an institution that I was told not to mention here.
Rhymes with jail.
And I was clerking for a federal judge in New York City, and I wanted to do something political early in my career. And the short of it is, just through A talking to B and B talking to C and C knowing me, I got an opportunity to go to work for Vice President Dan Quayle at the White House. And it was Bill Kristol, who was the chief of staff, and Spencer Abraham, the deputy chief of staff, who brought me in. And I always say to students, a good way to start in Washington is to have good references, be available when they need you, and be willing to work for very little money. And that's how I got my start.
We're going to go to the videotape because so many of the defining moments for every president, I covered 7 of them, are remembered at moments when they delivered. Let's start. Cody, you have brought President Obama's Selma speech. Set the stage. Where is he?
He's in Selma. This is my favorite, and it's probably there was the purest collaboration we ever had, and it's also the purest distillation of kind of his vision of America and our trajectory throughout time. And it was the 50th anniversary of the March on Selma, and it's easy to just go do a commemoration of an event and retell what happened there, but that's never quite been enough for Barack Obama. He always wants to add in a lesson, or what does it tell us in our time? What are we challenged to do?
Standing on the Edmund Pettus Bridge,
right.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Barack Obama.
That's what America is. Not stock photos or airbrushed history or feeble attempts to define some of us as more American than others. We respect the past, but we don't pine for the past. We don't fear the future. We grab for it. America's not some fragile thing. We are large, in the words of Whitman, containing multitudes. We are boisterous and diverse and full of energy, perpetually young in spirit. That's why someone like John Lewis said that ripe old age of 25 could lead a Marty March. And that's what the young people here today and listening all across the country must take away from this day. You are America, unconstrained by habit and convention, unencumbered by what is, because you're ready to seize what ought to be. For everywhere in this country, there are first steps to be taken. There's new ground to cover. There are more bridges to be crossed. And it is you, the young and fearless at heart, the most diverse and educated generation in our history, who the nation is waiting to follow. Because Selma shows us that America is not the project of any one person. Because the single most powerful word in our democracy is the word we. We the people. We shall overcome. Yes, we can. That word is owned by no one. It belongs to everyone. Oh, what a glorious task we are given to continually try to improve this great nation of ours.
That there is poetry there, his or yours?
Mostly his.
How did you call this a collaboration? How did the collaboration work? It's different from a kind of a policy speech that you might have written the day before.
For something like this, we'll actually sit down beforehand for about an hour, maybe once or twice, and talk about what we want to say. You know, what do we want to talk about here? And this speech was largely an argument against cynicism and apathy. And I think, you know, it's my favorite, so I highly recommend everybody go watch it or read it, but it rings even truer now than it did 2 years ago. You know, the trajectory of this country is up to us. If you're dissatisfied with your democracy, you know, when it's tempting to say government sucks and does nothing for me, well, you just have to look in the mirror and realize that it's only as good as we are. And, you know, the people there were humble, downtrodden, had no power whatsoever in Selma, and they changed the course of a superpower. And that's kind of been his view of history. And then one other quick thing, the one spark that gave that speech, yeah, you already know, the one spark that gave that speech a little extra life when we were trying to figure out how to make it pop was the week before Rudy Giuliani was, I don't even know what it was, he was at some event, some fundraiser or whatever, and caught on a hot mic saying, he began his comments by saying, I shouldn't say this, but, and when you start your comments by saying that, just stop yourself. Don't say it, like, don't caveat the Holocaust, don't, you know. And he said, you know, Barack Obama's not like us, he wasn't raised like we were, he doesn't believe America like we do. And I was just kind of tired of that BS after 8 years, after he was reelected twice. And I said, why don't we give a speech about who gets to define what being an American is all about?
And
you know?
this was, as I remember, is it June of 2015?
March 2015.
March 2015. So we are now in the last months, last year and a half of the Obama administration. And he had addressed race and inequality before, but there was something about that setting that, and as you said, it was an occasion, but it was also something about where he, as the first African-American president, had brought the country and how much there was still left to be done.
Yeah, and if you're going to try to define what a real American is, look at the people who crossed that bridge at great physical risk to themselves just to get the voting rights that they were promised. You know, not special treatment, but equal treatment. And for them to do that, I mean, what could possibly be more American than that?
At times of war and great danger, presidents are often called on for rhetoric that resonates for generations. Lincoln, Roosevelt, and then on a day when I happened to be with the president in Florida, September 11th, 2001. And I remember you, John McConnell, were in the West Wing with Vice President, right? When suddenly the Vice President was barely with his feet on the ground, whisked away to safety. It was the September 11th attacks. John, the rubble from the terrorist attacks in New York, Pentagon, and Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the rubble was still burning when President Bush went where to give this address?
To the joint session of the Congress, and it was 9 days after the attacks, so this is Thursday, September 20th. And I know for a lot of the people in the room, September 11th is something in the distant past. What you're about to see is when it was in the moment. And at that moment, we didn't really know if this was the extent of the attack, or if there was going to be follow-on attacks, or obviously we just didn't know. And it was as emotional a moment as it could possibly have been, because everybody in the country was feeling something deep. People were shocked, grief-stricken, livid, and terrified.
Ladies and gentlemen, President George W. Bush.
Great harm has been done to us. We have suffered great loss. And in our grief and anger, we have found our mission and our moment. Freedom and fear are at war. The advance of human freedom, the great achievement of our time and the great hope of every time, now depends on us. Our nation, this generation, will lift a dark thread of violence from our people and our future. We will rally the world to this cause by our efforts, by our courage. We will not tire, we will not falter, and we will not fail. It is my hope that in the months and years ahead, life will return almost to normal. We'll go back to our lives and routines, and that is good. Even grief recedes with time and grace. But our resolve must not pass. Each of us will remember what happened that day and to whom it happened. We'll remember the moment the news came, where we were, and what we were doing. Some will remember an image of a fire or a story of rescue. Some will carry memories of a face and a voice gone forever. And I will carry this. It is the police shield of a man named George Howard, who died at the World Trade Center trying to save others. It was given to me by his mom, Arlene, as a proud memorial to her son. It is my reminder of lives that ended and a task that does not end. I will not forget the wound to our country and those who inflicted it. I will not yield. I will not rest. I will not relent in waging this struggle for freedom and security for the American people. The course of this conflict is not known, yet its outcome is certain. Freedom and fear, justice and cruelty have always been at war. And we know that God is not neutral between them. Fellow citizens, Fellow citizens, will meet violence with patient justice, assured of the rightness of our cause, and confident of the victories to come. In all that lies before us, may God grant us wisdom, and may He watch over the United States of America. Thank you.
It's rare that we see the entire chamber stand like that, but of course it was a moment of crisis.
Yes, and on Monday morning, the 17th, Mike Gerson, the chief speechwriter, my colleague, for 5 years, Mike and Matthew Scully and I wrote presidential speeches together, starting actually when he was governor in Austin. He came into my office Monday morning and said, well, the president's pretty sure to be giving a speech at the joint session of Congress on Thursday, and he wants a draft today. I said, who said a draft today? Well, Karen knows we can't do that. She said, well, the president said that he wants it. And so we sat down and started putting thoughts together. It wasn't as if you were lacking for subject matter, but even so, in a moment like that, how do you start? How do you get this thing going? And I remember after a few hours of working, getting a lot of things down, and we actually had a page and a half of writing behind us. We got called to see the president, and we went over to see him in the Oval Office, and he asked how the speech was coming, and Mike said, we're working on it. And the president said, Americans have questions. They want to know who attacked us and why they hate us, and they want to know how do we fight and win this war and what is asked of us now. And there we had our organizing principle for the speech. He went through the questions. And the segment we just saw, the last few minutes, in a moment like that, all you need is plain English. You don't have to struggle to add emotion to the moment or anything like that. There are some nice lines that were the result of a team effort and also working directly with the president. But no Churchillian calls or anything like that. We don't live in an oratorical time. We live in more of a conversational time.
The president still had his hands full with a nation in shock, the ramifications of an attack, bodies lying still under the rubble. Did he have less time to help you with this? Was this more of a speechwriter-driven speech?
We didn't have a great deal of time because, given the one-day deadline, we presented it to him at the end of that Monday. We didn't have a conclusion, so those last few minutes were not written. But it was the president and Karen who were there when the three of us walked in, and we told them that we didn't have a conclusion, and they started talking about the police shield that he had received in New York on Friday from Marlene Howard, and we immediately thought that would be a very nice thing to mention at the end of the speech. So by noon Tuesday, that speech was written, and the president, as he always did, and you know him well, he's a serious editor of speeches, and he went over it many times. But it was compressed. The State of the Union, you go through days and days and days. This we had, a couple Oval Office meetings, and then a couple practices on Wednesday, and a practice on Thursday, maybe two practices on Thursday, maybe one on Wednesday afternoon, two on Thursday, and the president got a nap. And I thought, wow, he's about to speak. What we later learned was the largest audience in all history. And he took a nap that afternoon. That's one of the reasons he was president and not me. He could always relax before a big moment, and but it was very compressed. But he was inspiring us, and had inspired us from the day of the attacks, especially that moment on the rubble in New York, which was probably the signature moment of his presidency, and no involvement of speechwriters.
They'll hear from all of us soon. Not every speech is obviously a landmark in terms of identity and definition or a moment of national crisis. There are political speeches, but they also carry a very strong policy message. Sarah, where was Michelle Obama in the speech we're about to see?
She was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This was the Monday night of the 2016 Democratic National Convention, and this was her speech there.
And this is as she and the president are completing a presidency, not the earlier speeches that she had done before. Ladies and gentlemen, First Lady Michelle Obama.
That is the story of this country, the story that has brought me to this stage tonight. The story of generations of people who felt the lash of bondage, the shame of servitude, the sting of segregation, but who kept on striving and hoping and doing what needed to be done so that today I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. And I watch my daughters Two beautiful, intelligent black young women playing with their dogs on the White House lawn. And because of Hillary Clinton, my daughters and all our sons and daughters now take for granted that a woman can be president of the United States.
Sarah, there was tremendous power and tremendous history laced into that. How did that come about?
So, you know, she started the speech very personally, right? Talking about her daughter's first day of school, putting them into these big SUVs and the men with guns and their faces pressed up against the window. And she really used that as a way of saying, you know, for Barack and I, our kids are everything. And we are the same as President and First Lady. Everything we do is for our kids. And that was really the organizing principle of the speech. You know, she then went through why Hillary was the best president for our children. She then went through a long litany of all the ways that Americans come together to support our kids, coaching Little League, teaching Sunday school. You know, she talked about protesters in Dallas and police officers, just, you know, very moving. And then she got to that line, which was the history, right? This is the American story. The idea of each generation sacrificing, working, fighting for things that they know they're never gonna have, but that they hope that their children will. Very much the American story. And I think that, you know, ending it with a visual image of her two daughters playing on the White House lawn. You know, you have the house, I wake up every morning in a house built by slaves. That's a pretty powerful statement, but then the visual image of her two daughters on the White House lawn, I think that there's something indelible about that. So I love this part of the speech.
First ladies take a little longer to find their voice, don't they? In my experience, again, with only 7 of them, each one has taken several months at the beginning of an administration to kind of figure out where am I going to be, both on policy and in visibility. But they are not politicians who are used to going out giving speeches every day. So how is it different? And frankly, does it make a difference to have a female writer? Do you resonate with her better, do you think, than a male writer?
You know, it's funny. I think a lot of times people will ask me, you know, how did you get Michelle Obama's voice? And I think they're being polite. I think what they actually really want to ask me is, how did you, a white Jewish girl from, you know, a suburb of Boston, get the voice of an African-American woman from the south side of Chicago, right? That's what they really want to know. But the truth is, I think that so much of being a good writer for someone is sharing a sensibility about what makes a good speech and sharing common values. And you know, certainly her family's story in this country is very different from my family's story. You know, my family were, you know, Eastern European Jewish immigrants who've come here, but there is this similar strain of yearning and sacrifice for the next generation that I think we both very much resonate with. So I actually think those shared values, that shared sensibility about good speechwriting, it trumps a lot of other things that would make you think that someone would be good as a speechwriter for someone. In terms of finding your voice, you know, I actually think Mrs. Obama found her voice in many ways in her 2008 convention speech. And I think becoming First Lady was more about finding the issues she was going to be working on and finding how she would be balancing the role as First Lady with the role of mom, which is a very important role for her.
I've got to ask real quickly, did you write the 2012 speech, which found unusual echoes of the Republican convention in 2006?
It was actually the 2008. I did write 2012, but it was the 2008 speech that was echoed, and yes, I did write that one.
Yeah, were you surprised? Did you listen?
You know, the funny thing is I actually went to bed early that night. I woke up the next morning to emails all night long from reporters and emails from Cody, and I'm trying to figure out what has gone on, and you know, my reaction was, wow, this is just every speechwriter's worst nightmare. That was my honest reaction.
This is, of course, when Melania Trump told the Trump Organization speechwriter or person that, well, here are lines that she liked from Michelle Obama, and then ended up being given a script that had exactly those lines. Wait, I'm going to speed through 2 more quick clips, and then we're going to open this to your questions. There are moments at the White House which are delightfully fun and also laced with incredible political potential awkwardness. Imagine a president coming back for unveiling of his portrait when he beat the guy who came before him, and the president who is actually hosting the unveiling is the son of the guy you beat. John McConnell, we are going to show President George W. Bush at the unveiling of the Bill Clinton official portrait in the White House East Room. President Bush.
People in Bill Clinton's life have always expected him to succeed. And more than that, they wanted him to succeed. And meeting those expectations took more than charm and intellect. It took hard work and drive and determination and optimism. I mean, after all, you got to be optimistic to give 6 months of your life running the McGovern campaign in Texas. He won his first statewide office at age 30, sworn in as governor at 32. He was a 5-time governor of Arkansas, the first man from that state to become the president. He's also the first man in his party since Franklin Roosevelt to win a second term in the White House. And I could tell you more of the story, but it's coming out in fine bookstores all over America. At every stage in the extraordinary rise of Bill Clinton, from the little ranch house on Scully Street to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, he and Roger had a wonderful, loving mother. And I am certain that Virginia Kelly would be filled with incredible pride this morning.
John McConnell, the kinds of elements, do you bring those in, or was that kind of vintage George W. Bush?
Well, at this point, Mike and Matthew and I had been writing for him. We were in our 5th year of writing for him, so we knew he wanted to have it really be a nice speech, and 2 of our purposes were there. Number 1, to really make Bill Clinton laugh, because we always heard that he has a great sense of humor, and if you can really touch his funny bone, you've really done something. So that was purpose number 1, and purpose number 2 was to touch his heart. And as you can see, right at the end of the clip, after the president mentioned President Clinton's mother, he said, "Thank you for saying that." And George W. Bush has this natural grace to him, and so we knew exactly how to put this thing together. And we actually wrote it the afternoon of Ronald Reagan's funeral. We got back to the White House, and Harriet Myers, the staff secretary, said, "Have you guys done a speech for the Clinton portrait dedication?" No. Well, it's Monday morning. Anyway, so we wrote it that afternoon, and it was a lot of fun to do, and actually went over and watched the event.
There comes a time in every presidency when you've said almost all the things that you've got to say, and then you have to worry. How do I write my first rough draft of history? Ladies and gentlemen, President Barack Obama's farewell, or at least a portion of it, and then I'll get your take up. President.
America, we weaken those ties when we allow our political dialogue to become so corrosive that people of good character aren't even willing to enter into public service. So coarse with rancor that Americans with whom we disagree are seen not just as misguided, but as malevolent. We weaken those ties when we define some of us as more American than others. When we write off the whole system as inevitably corrupt. And when we sit back and blame the leaders we elect without examining our own role in electing them. It falls to each of us to be those anxious, jealous guardians of our democracy. To embrace the joyous task we've been given to continually try to improve this great nation of ours. Because for all our outward differences, we in fact all share the same proud title. the most important office in a democracy. Citizen. Citizen. So you see, that's what our democracy demands. It needs you. Not just when there's an election, not just when your own narrow interest is at stake, but over the full span of a lifetime. If you're tired of arguing with strangers on the internet, try talking with one of them in real life. If something needs fixing, then lace up your shoes and do some organizing. If you're disappointed by your elected officials, grab a clipboard, get some signatures, and run for office yourself. Show up. Dive in. Stay at it. Sometimes you'll win. Sometimes you'll lose. Presuming a reservoir of goodness in other people, that can be a risk. And there will be times when the process will disappoint you. But for those of us fortunate enough to have been part of this work and to see it up close, let me tell you, it can energize and inspire. And more often than not, your faith in America and in Americans will be confirmed.
Cody Keenan, there's a wonderful film called The End on CNN, documentary that showed you standing in the crowd down there watching that. Easiest speech you wrote? Hardest?
It was one of the hardest ones we've done, yeah. Because there were a lot of components to it besides this, but this was the most important part, and we wrote it exactly for this moment, because it is not tenable to have half of the country angry and upset every 4 to 8 years. And this is the roadmap for what to do if you feel that way. And one of the greatest, and it fits with everything he said since 2004, which is that this democracy and this government is only as good as we are, and the effort we put into it. And I can't tell you how many people have, tweeted at me and sent me emails saying, I'm running for office because of the clipboard line, or I've started up this organization because of that. One girl even sent me, she got 2 tattoos on her ankles of show up and dive in, which I don't recommend, but it was cool. And that, someone emailed me and said he's running for office right now because of that clipboard line. Wow. And that's the whole point. That's awesome, do that. Show up, dive in.
Yeah. Sarah, when you look back at the Obama years, this resonates, a real catharsis here?
It really does. I mean, you have to remember the context of this speech and Mrs. Obama's farewell was you had a lot of people saying, well, they should be standing up and leading the resistance and criticizing and, having all this negativity. And they said, no, we're going to do a perfect transition. And what they did instead is they articulated their core values and what I would argue are core American values. I mean, the First Lady's farewell address, which was to the American School Counseling Association, at first I thought that might be a little bit random as an audience, but it was actually perfect because these people work with young people. So she made her farewell address an address to young people. And she was pretty clear about what she thought, saying, if you're a person of faith, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, be proud of that, own it. If you're an immigrant or your parents are immigrants, be proud of that American tradition. I think that was a pretty clear and pointed statement of our values, and so they, went high. And I think that was the right choice.
In the time we have left, we're going to open this up to your questions. There are 2 microphones here on the floor and 2 up on the first level here. And the usual rules apply. Please introduce yourself. Ask in perfect speechwriter prose. Ask a question with clarity, brevity, and make sure it has a question mark at the end. And while you're moving to the microphones, we want to take a special chance to welcome former Senator Kelly Ayotte, who is with us tonight. She is on her visiting IOP fellowship, and we're glad you're here with us in the front row in a red jacket. Thank you, Senator, for being here. Thank you. first question. Thank you. Just go ahead and talk.
All right, I'm going to try and project using my diaphragm. Thank you so much for being here today and for sharing some of your success stories. And on that line, my name is Arohi Sharma. I'm a second-year Master's in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. I learn a lot from not only successes, but from failures, and I think that's something that we haven't touched on in the panel discussion today. So from your perspective, what has failure looked like as a speechwriter? Is it not expressing vulnerability when you think vulnerability would have come across stronger? Is it messages not getting across? Just wondering from your perspective, from your experiences.
Start with John.
When the boss isn't happy. You have an audience of one long before there's a great audience hearing the speech itself. You really don't feel good when your boss feels that you have missed the target, or it turned out to be just something that didn't connect, or what have you. But the crucial variable there is to get as much time as you can with the principal so that you know going in and in the interim between the drafting and the actual delivery that you've got some time to do some editing and working back and forth. Also, I think failure is, we see this all the time where the person giving the speech might be happy giving the speech, might be completely comfortable with the writing, but the speech is too long, it's too self-indulgent, things of that nature. No one needs to get up and give a 45-minute speech day after day after day, but I think there's a temptation to do that as well.
Sarah, can you add to that?
Yes, I mean, I think, I always say that the best advice I give about speech writing is to say something true. And that's not often where people start, right? They think, what will make me sound smart or funny or powerful, or what does the audience want to hear? But those are the wrong first questions. Your first question is, what is the deepest and most important truth I can tell at this moment? And I think people, when you don't really nail the answer to that question, a speech just doesn't feel compelling. It doesn't have a beating heart, and it will feel a little flat. It'll feel a little weak, especially the of this moment part. When you're kind of given the speech you've been given for 6 months, and it's a little bit like, just doesn't, it's like what's happening right now and what's the truest thing I can say. I think if you don't nail that, it doesn't quite work.
It's hard to really publicly fail in a speech because it's not like, we just write something beautiful and hand it to the president. There are also tons of policy aides involved and lawyers and fact checkers and comm staff. So it would be a massive failure of an entire administration basically to give it a terrible speech to everybody. But on a personal level, and this kind of touches what John said, it's keeping the boss happy, or at least living up to what the boss wants. The Selma speech we had before, I handed him a draft I thought was pretty good, but kind of safe, and he read it and he said, I gave it to him about 2 days before, and he said, I could probably deliver this as is, which he never actually means. And he said, but you took a half swing on this, go back and take a full swing. And there's also something liberating about that, where it's like him giving you permission to go nuts. And I grabbed Ben Rhodes and we put in some pretty good stuff and gave it back to him the next day, and he said, this is exactly what I was looking for.
Oh, that's a wonderful anecdote. Next question, Casey, identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Casey. I'm a senior at the college from Wisconsin, and I think most people would say any great speech is composed of two parts. You have the writing, and then you also have the delivery. And you guys are all very fortunate that you got to work with such great orators, but in situations where your principal is not the best speaker or tends to trip over their words, are there any strategies you as a speechwriter employ to make sure that they give better speeches and come across better to their audiences?
Practice. I mean, President Bush, he would take the speeches, we'd print them out in 23-point type. So, you can read it without your glasses. And then also he would practice those. And of course, covered President Reagan. One of President Reagan's speechwriters told me about being in the room with President Reagan when he was practicing a speech that he'd give. It was a campaign speech. Reagan was practicing, and he thought, what is he doing? He knows this speech. Reagan was getting into that moment, and it's just very important. President Bush would underline words, things he wanted to be sure to emphasize, things he would read aloud, things he didn't want to stumble over something, make it sound unfamiliar, because we've all seen that as well. So anyway, that's the key word, practice. Everyone has to do it.
I agree with all of that. I also think you write to your boss's level. And frankly, with the Obamas, that meant the sky's the limit, right? You can write, they can deliver anything. But I think with folks who maybe are not as gifted, you don't do so much poetry. You do maybe shorter sentences, maybe shorter speeches. If you just know this perhaps isn't their strongest suit, you write to their level.
Sometimes I've seen presidents give the same speech over and over again. You're on a round doing the same education speech 4 times. We could recite it along with the president. And sometimes I find their delivery on having to redo a speech like that over and over again suffers. You haven't.
And no one notices but the press corps if you do the same speech over and over. So
That's true.
Yeah, once I learned that, I was just cutting and pasting all the time. Beyond practice, I would also find someone that, whoever you're writing for respects and admires as a speaker, and make them watch the person speak. Make them watch YouTubes. I've never really given many speeches, but I gave my first kind of last month. And about 3 minutes into it, I realized I had no idea what to do with my hands. So for the rest of the speech, my brain was tortured. Like, what am I doing with my hands? Do I look like an idiot? Do I put it in my pockets? Like, am I pointing at people? And I was like, I've watched Barack Obama give 4,000 speeches. Why do I not know what to do? And I told him afterwards, he was like, well, you never put your hands in your pocket. Then you hunch your shoulders. And I was like, oh, thanks for that.
Thank you.
We have another question over here, and then we will go up to the upper level here. Yes, please, welcome.
Hello. My name's Joe Kerwin. I'm a sophomore at the college. I forget who said it, but someone said that we don't live in as much of a rhetorical time. Things are more conversational. I was wondering what that means when that shift happened and how that shapes your writing approach.
I don't know when it happened, but you're right. We don't say 7 years ago anymore. We say 87 years. Language has become more colloquial over time. And we never stretch too hard to be lofty. I mean, there are only certain moments that lend itself to that. For the majority of speeches, you want to be colloquial and conversational. And I actually think that's okay.
If you really had to pinpoint it, a historian would be better than I would, but I'd say Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, before Franklin Roosevelt, presidents gave longer speeches. We had, in the 19th century, after Lincoln, we never had anyone so eloquent, but you had just a long series of presidents in an era when speeches were very long and people expected speeches to be very long. But then when you had radio and Franklin Roosevelt and his natural gifts as a speaker, and you look at his speech to Congress after Pearl Harbor that could be given today, but it was not of the style of the period that he was born in the late 19th century. So I'd say it started around then. But then John F. Kennedy gave an inaugural address that was real, soaring oratory, and yet it fit the times. And since then, things have just gotten steadily more conversational. I mean, it's not substandard in every case because it's conversational. It's just the nature of the time we live in.
We have another question up here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Teddy. I'm a freshman at the college. This is kind of similar to Joe's question, but we've seen another sort of shift with presidential speeches with Donald Trump. They've become a lot more improvisational, a lot less practice. Do you think that this is going to have impacts on political speech writing down the road, or is this kind of just a singular phenomenon that belongs to Trump?
Well, it's not a singular phenomenon that belongs to Trump. He's certainly not the first person to try to wear the mantle of populism and riff on whatever comes to his mind. I don't think it's a great idea to get up there and just riff when you have no idea what you're talking about. But I also don't think it's a harbinger of a new age. I think there are really lots of good people in politics who are thoughtful and deep and passionate about their beliefs. And the reason we write things down is to organize our ideas in a fluid way. I would recommend that the president do that.
I would agree with that. I also think that there is a kind of misunderstanding that if you're kind of riffing, saying the first random thing that comes to your mind, you're somehow more authentic. And what I would ask you as students is, is a paper that you spent 2 weeks really honing and being careful and thinking about precisely what you want to say, compared to a paper that you slapped together 2 hours before the deadline, which is more authentic? which is the one that truly represents you? I think that the Obamas, President Bush, they put a lot of effort into making sure what they got up and said was what they exactly wanted to say. They were careful, they were thoughtful, and I don't think that made them less authentic. I think it made them more so.
I heard David McCullough say one time, writing is thinking, and thinking is hard. Woodrow Wilson, to prove that point, and he was president of Princeton, a professor, written all kinds of books, was a very able public speaker. But there's a story about him that he was asked to speak at an event, and he said, well, how long do they want me to speak for? Because I need to know how much time it'll take to prepare, because if they need me to speak for 5 minutes, I need a few days to prepare. If they need me to speak for an hour, I'm ready now.
And no speech is ever perfect, and no speech is ever done. You give me another day, I'll keep working on it and keep changing it. You give me 10 more days, I'll keep doing it and changing it.
Yeah. We have Red Sox, and then we'll come up here.
I'm from New York. I lost a bet.
It's okay. Looks good on you.
Thank you. So my name's Russell. I'm a third year at the law school. I'm wondering if you guys could talk about your motivations and your sources. I think it was a West Wing quote that good writers just crib from other good writers. So I'm wondering if it's writers you guys personally find incredibly moving. Maybe it's former judges for the two lawyers, and I'm also wondering if you could talk about the distinction between your motivational sources and the principles. So if you happen to have a principal who is particularly more pious, are you looking through religious texts more so than you ordinarily would, and where's that dividing line?
To answer the second part first, Obamas were generally Lincoln and Scripture, and it doesn't get a lot higher than that. I find it anywhere, literally anywhere, and I kept my Notepad app and my iPhone, and I would jot down whatever I see, and it could be, something I read, it could be a song lyric, it could be something in a comic book, it could be an ad in a bus shelter, a cool song. You can take inspiration from anywhere, and there's no such thing as too lowbrow, because you can make a lowbrow idea into something big and important.
How do you keep track of all those things on your phone or on a scrap of paper on a napkin?
Hashtags.
Hashtags. Anybody else with the...
I was often really moved and motivated by the folks that I was writing for. So if Mrs. Obama was going to give a speech at a college, I would call up the students at the college. She spoke at the City University of New York. That was her final commencement speech. And I talked to a number of students there, and these students are amazing. They're from 150 countries. They speak 99 languages. Nearly all of them are commuters. Nearly all of them are working a number of jobs. And just to hear their stories, that really moved me. It motivated me. And I think, doing that kind of research to really get the true stories of the American people, it's pretty inspiring.
So, John, you can be kind of a reporter when you're putting together these speeches. You do research, you do background. How important is that especially for a speech where you're not just pushing one particular policy, but where you really have to kind of put some breath into it?
Well, and also, if you're a speechwriter and you end up working for a president of the United States, of course, you ended up in that job. You probably have done a fair amount of reading in American history. You probably followed a lot of political news and stories for your whole life, and so you have a lot of favorite quotations, a lot of favorite historic images, a lot of favorite things that come from American history. And I remember hearing somewhere Henry Kissinger said, you don't accumulate intellectual capital in the White House, you spend it. So I remember after a few years I thought, I got to dig a little deeper for my stories. I've used all my favorites. But of course, you're still reading. And here I'm quoting David McCullough again. He once said that he writes the book he wants to read. And I thought, I'm going to remember that. I'm going to write the speech I want to listen to. And if it's boring writing it, it's going to be boring for the listener.
2 more questions. Yes, up here. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks for being here. My name is Sherry Hakimi. I was an HKS MPP 2012, and I took off 2 months to go work on the campaign in New Hampshire. My question is for Sarah about the Manchester speech in October. Did you write that, and what was the process behind it? Because it was incredibly powerful for those of us on the ground.
Thank you. So the speech that you're referring to, that was the speech that Mrs. Obama gave after the Access Hollywood video of Donald Trump gleefully bragging about sexually assaulting women, which was really obviously deeply disturbing to pretty much everyone. And Mrs. Obama had actually been wanting and planning to give a speech about the misogyny that we were seeing in this election for a while. So that speech was in the works, and then that video broke, and it was just, my draft seemed very quaint. when that video broke. It was so visceral and so shocking, not surprising, but very shocking. And I think that, you know, Mrs. Obama felt that speech so personally, and that speech really came from her. It was driven by her. She knew exactly what she wanted to say, as frankly she always did, but that speech had a particular power for her, and I think that it was reflected in her delivery. You know, I had been a little bit nervous that it would be this big screaming rally crowd and they would, you know, applaud over her and it would be drowned out, but I think her delivery was so passionate and so emotional that people just, they quieted down and they really gave her the space to deliver that speech, and it had a real impact. We got so many emails in the wake of that speech from women saying, thank you for saying this. I no longer have to feel ashamed of what happened to me. We got a lot of letters from men saying, thank you for saying that this is not how decent men behave. I really appreciate that. So I'm really proud of that speech.
So it's not unusual for there to be a speech idea rumbling around in the West Wing, in the East Wing, anywhere, and then you finally look for a way to let that critter out of its cage, right?
Yeah. Well, it was already, we had planned to give that speech then before the tape broke out. So when the tape came out, we thought, well, this certainly amps up the need for this speech.
Yeah, we have time for a little bit more. Yes, sir, right up here.
Hi, my name is Jackson, and I'm a freshman at the college. I just had a question about the difference between writing speeches on the campaign and for when someone's in office, because we see an incredible difference between the campaign promises and then what happens ultimately between when they're in office and maintaining support instead of, you know, gaining support in office, and the turnover for a speechwriter. Is it more incredible for like when you're on the campaign or versus, you know, when you're in office?
Good question. The greatest thing is when you are on a winning campaign, as we can all testify. Well, there are important differences because in the campaign, as a political observer, a savant friend of mine once said, before you're going to unite the country, you've got to do some dividing. And that's what campaigns are about. They're about defining the choice and what's at stake for the nation and what's going to happen if your adversary is elected versus what's going to happen if you're elected. And so it's really a stark, sharp contrast. And then once you're governing, that's not your job anymore to devise. Matter of fact, you speak for the whole nation. And another indicator of that is in the campaign you're writing these speeches. You know, should I be elected president, I will direct the secretary of thus and so to do this. Well, and then when you're a presidential speechwriter, you write, I am directing the secretary of thus and so to do this. It goes from, here's what I'd like to do, to guess what, I'm doing it today.
I will also say venue matters a lot with speeches. So I think that President Obama got a little bit of criticism when he was first in the White House of he's lost his mojo, he's not doing, he's not as inspiring. And like, you give a different speech to 30,000 screaming people in an arena than you do to 200 terrified people in the East Room of the White House who are sitting just, silently. It is just the most deathly place to give a speech. If you give the big screaming hope and change speech, you look insane. So, the truth is presidential venues are often less inspiring, less big than campaign venues, and that's a transition.
Reality intrudes too. I mean, when you're on a campaign, it's all blue sky, aspirational. We're going to do all these great things. You get to the White House and, Congress says, no, you're not going to do that one. Some of your own advisors say that's actually a really bad idea. And, other countries have a say too. So it's just, you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. Campaigning is so much more fun.
We've got time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Amy Gutman. I'm an alum of the college and the law school. I'm also a speechwriter. And so my question is sort of a tactical one. It seems to me in both listening speeches and then speeches I've worked on, watching them be delivered, that often the most powerful moments are personal moments or anecdotes or experiences of the person that sort of encapsulate and illuminate the larger themes. I also find it can be incredibly challenging to elicit those. And I'm curious if any of you have questions or certain lines of questions that you found especially effective and useful in eliciting that kind of material from people you're working with.
Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think I really try to dig deep. You'll say, okay, can you think of a story from your past? And then maybe they won't remember. How about college? How about this? Giving them more and more specific prompts in the hopes that they'll kind of dislodge something. But it's sometimes hard for people to come up with stories on command.
Why is always the best question. Get them to elaborate. Why do you feel that way? But we were always spoiled in the White House because the president would get 5,000 to 10,000 letters a day.
Yeah.
And so we just had people giving us their stories. And of course, we would call them and ask permission to use it in speeches, but we had this incredible content factory of America that was just funneling their stories into our mailroom every single day. So find that. You should get that.
Yeah, and it's a matter of getting to know the principal, because in some cases it could be, well, tell me more about that, or in other cases it will be, what have you been reading lately? Because a friend of mine told me he had written speeches for Jack Kemp, a longtime congressman, cabinet secretary, was a Republican vice presidential nominee in '96. He had a Super Bowl ring, and he'd been a quarterback for the Buffalo Bills, and so my friend got hired to write for him, and so he started putting all these football images in the speeches, and Secretary Kemp said, well, or maybe he was a congressman at the time, said, leave the football to me. So you got to get to know what your principle is.
I've got to wind this up with one question I've been just dying to ask, because I covered 7 presidents and a whole lot of presidential speeches, and actually campaign speeches and introductions of presidents. What's the really worst speech you've ever heard, or at least what you would warn potential speechwriters about don't ever, ever do? Footballs aside. And any thoughts?
Overwriting. I really think, I would say to anyone who's going to be writing speeches, just don't overwrite. It will be noticed that you are striving for a certain kind of effect. It will call attention to the writing as opposed to the matter at hand. The person reading the speech will be on very thin ice, because they're not going to sound like they're a real person. But I have seen this all the time. I wouldn't feel good about mentioning the worst speech I've ever seen.
Well, I will, I guess. You asked. I think it's a fair question. I think Trump's inaugural was an example for me. I think about President Bush's first inaugural, and man, what a gracious, graceful, uplifting statement of American values. I'm a Democrat, he's a Republican. That speech articulated my values. It articulated American values. It was something that really, I think, you could really bring the country together. And were there nods at certain Republican policies? Sure, but that was his right. He was elected, and I think that's what a great inauguration speech is. And I think, this one it was dark, it was negative, it was frightening, and I didn't think it really brought us together. I didn't think it articulated core American values, and that to me was a serious miss.
Any worst hits out there?
I'll follow John's lead and be diplomatic. It's one of the reasons I've loved working with Sarah for 9 years, though. She'll always tell you when your stuff sucks.
Well, with that, I can tell you as a reporter, the best presidential speeches are the ones when they ad-lib and give us the lead we had always looked for. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining Cody Keenan, Sarah Hurwitz, John McConnell. Thank you for joining us.